Courageous leadership is often defined by four compelling traits: confidence in oneself, commitment to one's values and beliefs, the ability to persist, and a warrior spirit. By those metrics, transgender activist and first time state legislator Zooey Zephyr is a rare leader with few peers in the social justice arena. The first ever transgender member of the Montana State Legislature, Zoe, a newcomer to politics in 2022, made national and international headlines in April 2023 when she stood in opposition to Montana state legislation that would prohibit gender-affirming healthcare for transgender youth. Her statements in support of transgender people caused her to be banished from the State House floor, denied the opportunity to debate, and forced to operate as a duly elected representative of her state from a public bench in a hallway of the Montana State House. In this moving interview with PFLAG Cape Cod's Rick Kuntz, Representative Zephyr talks about the furor her presence caused on the State House floor, the passion she brings to her advocacy of transgender people, and how her experience as a champion high school wrestler helped prepare her for the nasty, rough and tumble world of partisan politics. Representative Zooey Zephyr, welcome to Profiles in LGBTQ+ Courage. It's a pleasure and honor to have you with us today.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me.
In recent weeks, it's fair to say that you've become the very public face of transgender rights in the United States. You're the first ever transgender member of the Montana State Legislature and a relative newcomer to elective politics. But in your short time in office, you've become a lightning rod in the culture wars, currently engulfing the nation and in many cases playing themselves out in state legislatures. Last month, in April of this year, you were banished from the Montana State House floor for admonishing your Republican colleagues who were supporting legislation to prohibit gender-affirming medical care for transgender minors. That's when the firestorm erupted. And I'm wondering, can you share with our listeners what happened that day and how you found yourself having to conduct your work as a state legislator from a bench in a state house hallway?
Yeah, we were hearing the governor's amendments to Senate Bill 99, which is a bill that bans gender-affirming care for trans youth. And this bill was one of many bills targeting the LGBTQ community and particularly the trans community. We had seen bills banning our art forms in drag. We had seen bills banning books about our histories. We had seen bills saying that it's okay for kids to essentially bully trans people in schools by continually using dead names or the incorrect pronouns. And then we saw bills like Senate Bill 99 banning access to healthcare, life-saving healthcare. And so after hearing all of these bills and deciding it's time to stand up and say something, hold them accountable for what these bills actually do. And so I rose up and I spoke to the real harm that these bills bring to my community, and not just anecdotal harm. We know from the statistics that trans youth who receive gender-affirming care have a 73% reduction in suicidality. But I was also talking to real community harms that we have seen in Montana. I had lost friends to suicide this year. I know folks who were attacked on the side of the roads. There was a story of someone who was run over by a car outside of a bar because they were trans. We had a trans teen who attempted to take her life while listening to one of these anti-trans hearings, and another who attempted suicide and in the ER. When the doctor said, "What's wrong?" she said, "My state doesn't want me."
Yeah. Oh, you delivered some pretty powerful comments on the House floor. You admonished your colleagues and said, and I quote, "If you force a transgender child to go through puberty when they are trans, it is tantamount to torture, and this body should be ashamed." And then I think you had a brief interaction with a Republican colleague, and you continued, "If you vote yes on this bill and yes on these amendments, I hope the next time there's an invocation when you bow your heads in prayer, you see blood on your hands." Now, we've heard that kind of language used by legislators in other venues, but in this case, it issued from there such a blowback from your Republican colleagues, and it also led the Montana Freedom Caucus to issue a statement misgendering you and calling for your censure. Now, where do you think this disproportionate response came from? What was that about?
Unclear exactly where it came from. When the majority leader stood up and objected, both initially to my comments about torture and that the body should be ashamed, and then to my later comments, that's something that we've seen throughout the session. There have been Republican lawmakers who have screamed during their closing. There have been Republican lawmakers who have insinuated that somehow my very existence as a trans woman is a threat to children. And we object. We stand and the minority leader objects, and then we move on because we are here to debate the hard bills. So I wasn't surprised that Majority Leader Vinton stood up and said that. But what we have begun to see is that as the growing extremism in the Republican Party begins to take root in that party, they are beginning, it is not enough for them to bring these bills forward. It is not enough for them to pass this harmful, hateful legislation. They're beginning to use every tool at their disposal to silence dissent, silence opposition. And so what we saw is an effort to silence someone who had stood up in defense of their community and said, no, you need to be quiet during this. And what I said to the speaker when I refused to apologize, and what I'll say again, is to be silent about the real harm, the life-threatening harm that a bill like this brings. To be silent there is to be complicit in that harm, and we will not be complicit in our own eradication.
And when decorum is invoked as an excuse to shut down conversation, it reminds me of, I think, the old William Faulkner story about the mantle of Southern respectability. It's like decorum must prevail when we would otherwise be forced to have, quote, unpleasant conversations, right?
Yeah, exactly. You think negative peace, positive peace. You're looking at the way in which not standing up, the way in which that you utilize the tools of the systems of government to enforce silence, to enforce marginalized communities, to not be able to defend our communities when we are the ones being most impacted. You saw that here in Montana. You saw that in Oklahoma when Representative Mauree Turner, non-binary, Black, Muslim representative, was censured. And in Tennessee, when they stood up to speak to the real harms of the epidemic of gun violence.
It strikes me here that there's a psychological component here and an effort on the part of the other side to really try to get inside the minds of transgender people and kind of play with their minds. And there's almost, the marginalization, the shutting down of your voice. I'm wondering, Zoe, when a trans person is disrespectfully misgendered, how does that land? Is that analogous to the N word being used with a Black person or the F or D word being used with a gay or lesbian?
Well, I think when we talk about the N word with a Black person, you think about sort of the historical roots and how much more elevated something like that is, given the original sins of this country towards Black and Indigenous folks in our community. But I do think it is an effort when you misgender somebody. It is an effort to try to remind them that they're an other, to somehow lessen them. And I think if for many trans people, that is deeply, deeply painful. But I also think when the Freedom Caucus misgendered me, I was unbothered. And I was not unbothered because, it's not a harmful thing to do. I was unbothered because I'm familiar with their hypocritical actions to call for civility as you misgender somebody. It is a section of their party that calls for limited government while using government to take away healthcare from subsets of people. And so it can be a hurtful phrase. It does, make trans people feel less accepted. But when you're doing work in politics, when you have work to do that needs to be done in this arena, you don't let it phase you. You keep your head up and you move forward.
It strikes me as we talk here that there's a warrior spirit in you, which is really essential. And it's a kind of leadership edge. It's what keeps you going, even when you're having to deal with those kinds of cruel remarks. And so, since this uproar occurred in the State House, you have been interviewed everywhere. I've seen and heard you everywhere. I heard you this morning. I heard you last night. And what's it been like to find yourself and suddenly rocketed into this place of prominence and in the media maelstrom?
I vowed when I was running for office, I met with State Senator Bryce Bennett, who was the first openly gay man to serve in the Montana legislature. And what I told him was, my deepest hope is to get in the rooms that my voice can do the most good. Is that room the state legislature? Should I, school board, city council, nonprofits? And he said, the state legislature, that's, your voice can do good in that room. And so I ran, and I was blessed to be supported by my community and to get elected to represent them. And now what I'm finding is that I'm being invited into a wide array of rooms like this one. And I ask myself, how do I use my voice most effectively in this room to try to bring about positive change? Yes, both for the LGBTQ community broadly, the trans community specifically, and also the myriad of issues I care about, renters' rights, healthcare, etc. And for me, that's, I think, the crux of it. And because of how quickly in succession these rooms have been, with the media maelstrom, as you call it, I don't really have time to process and reflect about, the scale of what's happening or the way in which the needle is shifting when it comes to trans rights. I had someone say, thank you for having these conversations. They would not have been possible 6 months ago. It was just a different landscape. And I believe that, but also because of the speed, my focus is to look at the next moment, do my best to rise to it, and do my best to do some good.
So true. And when we spoke the other day, I said that one of the things I find remarkable about you, if I may make this observation, because I am an executive coach in my workaday life, is I work with a lot of leaders who struggle to find their voice and who really need to figure out how to lead with a firm intention. And, you've got that. You've got that at a relatively young age. And I'm wondering, where do you find your strength and conviction? And how do you kind of draw on that when you need to go into these tough situations, these tough rooms?
I love the relatively young age. I love that. I feel that's perfectly encapsulates 34. But for me, I think of two things. One is sort of when I transitioned, I started talking about what I call like the concentric circles of care. Like, you first have to deeply care for yourself. Like, as an individual, you have to be able to look in the mirror and be proud of who you see and proud of the values that you stand for. And I worked a long time to get that before I could, start taking it to bigger circles in my friends and neighbors, into my bigger community in Missoula, and then into systemic work like politics. But a lot of this comes from my history in athletics. When I was a wrestler from the age I was 4 until about 20.
Were you?
A multi-time state champion wrestler. And the day in, day out work of athletics, of, my wrestling room, my coach had a plaque just outside at the edge of the room that said, every day I leave this room a better wrestler and a better person than when I entered. And he said, slap that sign as you leave. And if you haven't become a better wrestler, stay back and we'll drill. If you don't feel like you've become a better person, stay back and we'll talk it out. Wonderful man, youth pastor. And I loved, wrestling and was happy to have success in it. But the thing I took from that is striving every day to be a better person. And that's a lesson that's been ingrained deep in my heart. It's something that gives me the ability to stand tall and to connect it to issues. It's one of the reasons I'm also a fierce advocate for trans athletes.
This is a wonderful insight about you, which I have not heard brought up much in other media interviews, and I want to come back to it in a minute. But before we go there, I want to ask you, you project and convey, to me, a surprising amount of positivity and optimism about where the discussion about all of this is going. And where does that come from? And talk more about that. You talk about being trans hopeful, embracing trans hope.
Yeah, the legislatures can do a lot of harm. They can take away rights, they can take away health care. But the thing I try to remember is that trans people have been on this land before this land was called America. And trans people will be here long after these bills are in the dustbin of history. And not just our existence has been that way, but our joy and our love. And I hold on to that because they can take away various aspects. They can take away books, but they cannot take away my joy and my hope. And also, I look at the way in which this fight for trans rights is such a clear echo of the fight for gay rights in the 90s. You look at the way in which the same handful of detransitioners are being flown around to testify, and it mirrors the same way that, quote, ex-gays were being flown around in the 90s to, talk about why being LGBTQ was not real. And you also look at the way in which in the 90s the dialogue was, well, gay and lesbian folks, they aren't having children, so they're, quote, recruiting. And now you see the conversation about trans people as, quote, grooming. So you see the same echoes of harmful rhetoric, but they will lose this fight against trans people for the same reason they lost the fight against gay and lesbian people. And that is because we're in your communities. We're part of your communities. We're your friends, we're your neighbors, we're your colleagues. And wherever you go, you are never far from a trans person or someone who loves us deeply, and you cannot win on hateful policy when that is the truth.
Yeah. I know you're in touch with your colleagues in Tennessee and their own recent experiences of speaking truth to power. Can you share a little bit about what that conversation has been like? And you all are comrades in arms, aren't you?
Exactly. And I think what we're seeing, again, underpinning this, is the growing extremism in the right and how they will use every tool to silence people speaking up on behalf of their communities. And they are picking specific targets. They picked Representative Maury Turner in Oklahoma, picked me here. I think Megan Hunt's under investigation in Nebraska, the Tennessee Three, picking them. But what we're understanding is that when they come for one of us, they are coming for all of us. And they are not just like their attacks on trans rights when it came to sports wasn't their end goal. Their end goal was the eradication of trans people from public life entirely, as Michael Knowles said at CPAC. But when they're coming for trans people, the entire LGBTQ community is on the chopping block. When they come for gun rights and are coming after young Black men speaking up in defense of their communities, they're under attack. It's why one of the first groups to stand up in defense of me in Montana was our own American Indian Caucus.
You mentioned that, yes.
That said, hey, we see this for what it is, and we're here to tell you there's a long history of this in our state and in our country. And so the conversations with these legislators have been about connecting, intersectionally with what's going on and intergenerationally, and saying, we see this moment for what it is. We see the way when we stand up that courage can be contagious. And the question is, how do you take a moment like this that feels like it's on the precipice of a movement? And how do you make sure that in our communities, people understand that they too can stand up in defense of their communities and in defense of democracy?
Yeah. Well, let's pivot a little bit now and talk a little bit about you personally. And I love the story about wrestling. I hated wrestling myself, but I'm glad that for you, it was a wonderful experience. And talk a little bit more about your upbringing, your family. And if I may ask, when you were a wrestler, was that before or after transition?
Yeah, well, it was before my transition. I was born in Billings, Montana, the Magic City, and went out to Washington for late middle school, high school, and college, and then came back to Missoula, Montana for grad school and to settle down back in my home state. And so my wrestling my father was a wrestler, and so he, when I was picking all the different sports, I landed mostly on soccer and wrestling. And so did that throughout most of my young life. And it was as I say, it was one of those places that brought me such valuable lessons, both in like determination of practice, but then you also think like the way wrestling meets work when you're in high school is you get points for each match and you're a team of 13. And so you can do as good as you possibly can and you can, win a match in 15 seconds. But you are only as strong as the rest of your team. And so in training, you're drilling your own stuff, but you're helping everyone because you succeed individually and get merits individually, but the team succeeds and fails as a collective. And so for me, that was a pivotal moment in my life. And then I left college there and I transitioned later in my late 20s. I think actually right on my 30th birthday is when I started.
It's interesting. I will share with you that when I have interviewed leaders of companies and organizations, they will often cite experience as part of a team sport or some kind of pivotal sports experience that they had growing up as something that was very foundational for them. And clearly this was the case for you.
Yeah, and I think what you see, and I talk about this with musicians as well, because I teach dance in town in Missoula. And what you see is, I think, are, activities where both individual excellence, individual mastery is important, and collective work is important. The way you would succeed in a band, your guitarist can be a wonderful guitarist, but without a drummer, the band falls. And in the same way with sports, that ability to hone yourself to be the best you can possibly be on an individual level, but understand that collective is needed as well. And I think that is a lesson that regardless of how you get it, whether it's sports, whether it's music, whether it's any sort of club activity, it's integral. Because when I find myself stepping into a political arena, you're obviously building, you have goals, you have things you want to accomplish, and policy things that you're crafting. But it's an understanding of the collective work as well, both in that legislature and in your communities.
I think it's a really good point. And I think going forward for you, you are, as we say in corporate parlance, you're not an individual contributor. You're a member of a team, and you clearly understand how important it is to have an ensemble around you. And so my hope for you going forward, and I think everyone who's rooting you all on, is that you will begin to build that coalition of support to really drive change. It might take a while, but it's going to happen because you know how to kind of create and engage others.
That's exactly the aim, is how do you take something like this and make sure that, when I returned to Missoula, the organizers in this town put on an event in 24 hours, start to finish, got it going. And it was a multi-day event, and connecting with them and saying, okay, what comes next? What comes next? Obviously politically, in 2024, what are we looking at? But also communally. Okay, Ford, Montana, you do a lot of political work, but they also do skill shares. They also do activities with young people across the state and make sure that everywhere in this state, we're building that sense of community. And then work with my work as a politician with, as I mentioned, Tennessee 3, Maury Turner, Oklahoma, folks in Nebraska. How do we begin to build that coalition across the country? That work is in its early stages, as it has to be in this moment, given how recent it is. But that is the goal, as you say, to make sure that collectively we can come together, because if the arc of history bends towards justice, it's because all of us come together to bend it.
Now, PFLAG, as I'm sure you know, is an organization for people who identify as LGBTQ plus and their friends, families. And I know one of the things that our listeners will be interested in knowing about from you is you're a little bit more about your personal transition journey. So if we can talk a little bit about that, when did you first discern that you were transgender? What were the signs for you? And can you describe a little bit what that journey of transition was like?
Yeah, I think I knew from an early age that I was trans, or rather, I knew I was a girl, we'll say, is the better way to put that. And I knew that, late in the single digits and into my teens. But the struggle was, I didn't have the word for it. And so when you don't have the word and you don't have role models that you can look to, you feel lost. And so I spent a lot of my teens and 20s feeling a little bit lost. And the way I describe it, it's as if when someone is talking to you, they aren't looking you in the eye, they are looking over your shoulder. And they're talking to a person that apparently has done the same things you've done. And you sound like the same person, but they're not actually speaking to you. And there's that dissonance that you feel, and you feel it every day. And then in my 20s, someone, I heard the word trans, like I came to understand what it meant to be trans, and it was suddenly like it snapped together. And I could see, oh, this is the thing that I had been feeling my whole life. And from that moment in my mid-20s, it took another couple years before I had the courage to come out to someone and say, hey, this is the thing. And I came out to a partner, and I came out to my parents, and my partner and I split, and my parents did not take it incredibly well. And so I sat with myself for a second, and I said, is this something I can do? That hurt. Is this something I can do? And the answer was, it's the only thing I can do, because it is the only way to actually be in resonance with myself, to be whole as a human being. And so I transitioned, and I told all of my colleagues on day one and said, hey, here's what's going on. And I was blessed that my colleagues and bosses at the university were supportive. And quickly I found myself rooting in my community throughout Missoula in a way that I had always dreamed of, but had never been able to until I became fully accepting of myself, until I came, as I said, in resonance with who I was.
I've interviewed quite a number of transgender people for this series, and they say much the same thing. It's about this eureka moment or this epiphany moment when one feels in alignment with oneself and one really belongs to oneself. And well, if I can push you a little bit to sort of go a little bit deeper on one thing that we who are not transgender, I think we struggle at times to kind of appreciate what it is that is going on inside one. When you say you knew, what is it that you recognize there was a dissonance? You were assigned male at birth, and what wasn't in sync? What was it? Feelings? Was it roles? Was it sort of just, you described it as sort of like speaking in a disembodied way, but can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'll use another metaphor and then maybe talk some examples. But I think of picture a spider web, made of strands of silk, strands of silk. It isn't one piece of silk that makes the spider web. There's not makeup or dress or clothing or God knows what that just could be done. But in totality, the way in which each of those strands of the web of silk come together and the gaps that are left, the things that are missing, it is in totality that I was able, you see the whole product. And so I think there are moments that I could speak to of, being a child, and when they split by gender, you default go to the girl because you're girl side, because your brain's like, that's who I am. Moments like that. There's moments growing up, and I'm bisexual, and being attracted to a man and being in my teens, that feeling being deeply wrong. And I was like, this isn't what I want. This isn't what I like. Why? I'm not a gay man. Why am I attracted to men? And it's like, oh, you're actually attracted to men in a very straight way because you're a woman. This is what that is. And so there's bits of those moments that come together. But again, it is no individual thing. It is the totality of that web, both what is present and what is absent. And when you take a step back and have that aha moment, it's because you look back and realize, oh, that is a web, and in its entirety, I'm a trans woman.
And it's a really holistic way to look at yourself. And so, may I ask you what the state of your relationship with your parents is these days?
Yeah, so my parents did not take my transition well. On that day, they had left, and there was some harsh words said to me. And then there have been a handful of reconciliation attempts on our sides, but have not quite come to a place. When your family says the kinds of things that were so incredibly hurtful and put me in, a very dark place following that. I wanted to feel like, am I going to have a family that loves and supports me? Because at this point, like I'm able to stand tall in myself. And if I don't feel like I have a family who will love and support me, I need to be really careful about letting them into a spot where they could hurt me again. And the desire for reconciliation is there. Of course it is. But that will be to be determined, as I think with all things here, I remain hopeful.
Good for you. And have they been in touch with you since your public prominence?
I'm not sure. There is a person that they are supposed to go between in their communications with me, and I haven't heard anything. But also, I've been really busy, so that person may be
Yeah.
holding off, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
You spoke just a moment ago about the importance of believing and really sustaining yourself. One of the things we talk about in PFLAG quite often is this idea that as a member of the LGBTQ community, you need a community of support around you. And I'm wondering, can you talk a little bit about the pillars of personal support to you? I know it's your constituents in Missoula who are there for you. I'm wondering who else is and what roles do they play in your ensemble, your personal ensemble?
Well, you talk about my constituents in Missoula. It is Missoula in its entirety. I don't have a car. This is a place, a city, our public transit is free in Missoula, as it should be everywhere. And I bust through my city every day. I go to the farmers markets on the weekends. I go to park cleanups. So I have just so many connections there. I worked at the university, and so I know a slew of students who have gone through there and settled down. The staff there. I taught dance. I teach dance in town, and so I have an array of dance students that are connected there. And from that, I've made some of my closest friends. Is a former dance student of mine that I got paired with for a fundraiser, and there have been so many people and so many close friends of mine. I talked about Ford, Montana, and the organizers who work there. I've become very close with them. And so for me, that's I couldn't say who is in the deepest personal ensemble besides my partner Aaron and like my friend Emily, former dance friend. But I find myself surrounded by so many close friends that I feel I'm blessed, just so blessed.
Wonderful, wonderful. And would you care to say anything about Aaron or your?
Aaron is my light. I could not have done the things that I've done without her being there in the hard moments. Because it is easy to stand tall when you are doing the right thing. It is easy to stand tall when you have Missoula backing you. But all of the work, is work. And you're up at 5, you're in bed by 9, you're up at 5 again the next morning. Go, 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 go. And to have someone at the end of the day who can be there to love you and cherish you, it is refueling in a way that I think what we find in the LGBTQ community is you both need that deep personal individual love and the community love and support. And I feel incredibly blessed to have both, and am humbled by the work Erin does as well, because she is a rock star.
Yeah, she's a journalist, right?
Yeah, she tracks all anti-LGBTQ legislation across the country and reports on it. The thing she always says is whatever the worst bill of the day is, she's watching it. And she's watching it so she can hold them accountable so that these bills don't pass in the quiet of night, so that we are bearing witness to the attempts to do harm. And she she does a Substack and does her journalism, and to make sure that people know that all of that cruelty gets brought to light, and that the hope as well gets brought to light.
Wonderful, wonderful. Just a few more questions, Zoe. I mean, really, I really appreciate your your authenticity and your engagement here. And it strikes me that you're really at an inflection point in history. And I kidded you the other day. I think you might be the transgender Rosa Parks. We'll see what happens. And not to put too much of a load of burden on you, but I do want to go back to the political thing for just a minute. It strikes me that if we put the whole issue of transgender rights in a larger frame, it so much of this, it strikes me, boils down to issues of social power, privilege, control. Now, obviously, I am a white cisgender gay man, and 40 years ago, my life was pretty controversial. Now it's yesterday's news. And I think I told you we have a daughter and a granddaughter. We have two granddaughters. And my hope for you is that in a few years, it's going to be a little less conflictual for you. But I'm curious what your thoughts are about this issue of power and control that the alt-right is really fighting back with a vengeance. I mean, they're really trying to, it seems to me, roll back social progress, the stuff that started in the 60s.
Yeah, and it's not just what are their ideological aims, it's what are they willing to do to achieve those ideological aims? What are they willing to toss aside? And what we saw in Tennessee, in Oklahoma, and what we saw here in Montana is that they will toss everything aside to achieve their goals, including the very first principles of our country, including representative democracy. And it is, again, about wielding power, about an image of the country as they wish it to be, which is, a narrow misdefining of Christianity. Like there's this image that they have about, here's the boxes that people belong in. Here are the things that are appropriate here are appropriate ways to be a human existing in the world. And again, you do see them attempting to utilize the tools of whatever systems they can get into, including the tools of government, to achieve that aim. And if those tools are inconvenient, they will toss them aside.
Yeah. So as we wrap up here, and I said to you earlier that you bring tremendous poise and presence and strength to the work you're doing. And what's your advice to transgender people now who maybe think they're transgender, they're not sure, maybe they're in that bargaining, denial phase? What's your advice to people who may be struggling with this? How do they progress and take good care of themselves?
I think, say take good care of yourself is step one. And that means I know the hard nights. I know the nights of looking in a mirror and thinking something's off. This is wrong. And I can't put my finger on it, or I put my finger on it, but I'm not going to say the word trans because the moment I say that, I don't feel like I can deny what this is anymore. I understand that fear, but make sure that you take time to be gentle with yourself in this process. And we talked about, again, step one is caring for yourself, understanding that you have value and that things are going to be okay. The whole trite notion of it gets better. I think it's important to note that sometimes the trite things are true things, and it does get better. You find yourself in community in a way that was not possible previously. There can be loss, there can be risk. But if you stand tall in yourself, and if you come to accept who you are and love who you are, and not be afraid of that, you will find that whatever cruelties the world throws at you, you will be buoyed and buffered by the love and support of your friends and your neighbors.
Yeah. So well said. So well said. So is there anything, Zooey, that we have not talked about that comes to mind or that has bubbled up as we've talked that you'd like to share with our listeners?
No, I'm grateful. I've never felt more in community with people across the country than I do right now. And I hope the folks who, looked to what happened in the legislatures across the country this year and looked to what happened to me in Montana, that they don't find themselves giving in to despair. It's easy to look at the cruel things and say, we live in an unjust world. We live in a place where the laws themselves are used to harm communities. It's easy to despair. And I hope people see that it's also easy to stand. And I hope that whatever rooms, yes, I'm in the legislature standing up against legislators bringing these bills, but that room that I'm in is no more or less important than the rooms you find yourselves in on a daily basis. And if we stand up in our individual rooms, we will see that we are standing collectively. And that is how we make change. That is why I have hope.
Well, Zooey Zephyr, State Representative from Montana, thank you so much for your courage and engagement with me in this interview today. I have a feeling, Zooey, that the late civil rights icon John Lewis would say that you are in the business of fomenting good trouble, quote unquote. You probably know that phrase, shaking up the system and not being silenced by the oppressive words and actions of others. So thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to today's interview. Founded in 1973, PFLAG is the first and largest organization for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer people and their parents, families, friends, and allies. We have over 400 chapters and more than 200,000 members and supporters nationwide. Our members come from every generation and live in cities, small towns, and rural areas across the United States. PFLAG is committed to creating a world where diversity is celebrated and all people are respected, valued, and affirmed. For more information about PFLAG, explore the rest of this website or visit PFLAG National at pflag.org.